And thank you everyone for joining us for this lunchtime webinar, where I think the main star of the session is going to be Richard, who is the lead author of this UKERC review, systematic literature review of clean jobs, green jobs associated particularly with low carbon or renewable energy and energy efficiency policy investment compared to supporting fossil fuels. So the review updates a piece of work that was done by UKERC back in 2014. So it's really asking questions about what have we learned in the interim, what new news is there, if you like, about green jobs in response to the development of renewable energy and energy efficiency. And that tricky question, I think, about that we all are aware of about how many net jobs result. In other words, what's the difference between new jobs created in those industries and jobs perhaps displaced in the oil and gas and coal industries, the fossil fuel industries. There are, as again, I imagine most of our audience are aware, there are some challenges always in doing this type of systematic review because of the evidence, because you're inevitably trying to compare multiple sources of data around different political, economic, and geographical contexts, which don't necessarily share the same definitions and assumptions of what counts as a relevant job for that question, a relevant job created through policy support and investment in renewable energy and energy efficiency. So the paper uses a range of definitions, which I think Richard will talk about, relating to estimates of direct jobs created, but also indirect supply chain related, if you like, jobs. And also this interesting idea of jobs that are induced by those who are employed directly in the sector, who then have disposable incomes to bring other jobs into being. So direct, indirect and induced jobs come into the picture. There are also, of course, questions in the challenges category here about methods that might be used reliably and robustly for estimating the total number of new and displaced jobs and how what the ratio between them looks like. Now, working very systematically, I think it's a very impressive piece of work, looking systematically at managing those issues and explaining what assumptions have been made. I don't think I'm spoiling anything by saying that one of the key review findings is that policy for an investment in manufacturing and installing renewables maybe, academic hedging there, may be a particularly effective short-term stimulus for jobs. So interesting in the context of the new energy security strategy. And of course, I want to ask Richard, has that strategy got it right? It's promising, Janet referred to this, it is promising to increase UK domestic-based, if you like, domestic economy-based clean jobs by 2030, quoting an increase of something like 30,000 jobs in offshore wind, in addition to the 60,000 previously expected. Also just about doubling the previous number of expected jobs in solar power up to about 10,000, so that's 40,000, 35 I suppose, and then about 3,000 additional jobs in a hydrogen industry, in addition to the 9,000 previously expected. So some new jobs in the frame there in this new energy security strategy, but of course one of the areas of debate has been about immediate benefits from energy efficiency and insulation of building stock for lower energy use, which has lots of co-benefits for all of us. And the review, this systematic review, concludes those areas are particularly positive for job creation. Now, there's not a lot of news there, I have to say, as far as I can see in the new strategy. So I also went to look, out of interest, in the context of this Green Jobs paper, at the 2012 UK Energy Security Strategy, which was the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition government work 10 years ago, a decade ago. I have to say that made no reference to jobs other than those in the oil and gas sector, where it estimated something like 350,000 jobs were in exploration and extraction at the time, albeit only 30,000 of those were in the direct oil and gas exploration and extraction sector. So those numbers that are running around there, interesting in terms of what will we see from this new energy strategy, and how can we as researchers investigate and test out the proposals and promises that are in those kinds of strategies. I'm sure Richard is going to have some messages around that. But perhaps important to say that jobs have reappeared as a matter of policy concern in the new security strategy, which is welcome, certainly, but perhaps raises some questions about feasibility and realism, which I think are also central to this piece of systematic review work. Important questions addressed too, which I will just briefly introduce and then hand over rapidly to Richard, about impacts of the short-term investment that we're being led to expect, in this case in energy security, the impacts of that on longer-term economic prosperity and job creation. And this is an important part of the review, asking where any longer-term benefits actually accrue. Geographically, how are they dispersed? Domestic manufacturing jobs, of course, depend on having a manufacturing base. There is a reference to British manufacture of heat pumps in the new energy security strategy. So we could have some questions there about will these be more than what we used to call screwdriver plants when I was working on employment and jobs? Will they actually bring the skilled jobs into Britain? And does that matter or not? Again, questions that are addressed in this piece of systematic review. How will those sectors evolve over the longer term? Because for me, I would argue work and employment are critical to social security, not just our energy security, social prosperity, and indeed societal stability, making it abundantly clear that we are needing the insights which this review provides. And Richard, over to you to present the key findings. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jan, for introducing this piece of work. So this is a systematic review the report was published yesterday, and looks at different aspects of job creation, quality and skills. It's conducted by myself with some help from my colleague Phil Heptonstall in the early stages, and with oversight from Robert Gross, Director of UKERC. So our main research question was to look at how many jobs can be created by policy support for investment in low carbon energy and energy efficiency compared to supporting fossil fuel incumbents or generation. And we had research sub-questions around how many jobs can be created and metrics that have been used to quantify job creation in low carbon energy, including renewables and nuclear, energy efficiency and fossil fuel generation. We also looked at the quality of jobs created and skills. So we looked at the implications of job creation policies for job quality and which metrics have been used to assess quality and skills. And then finally, we considered studies which looked at regional local job creation. So are there relevant metrics and evidence in the literature on that? And overall, it has to be said that the evidence is much stronger on how many jobs can be created, but we did identify some evidence on quality of jobs and to a lesser extent on geographic aspects as well. And in terms of sectoral focus, we focused on renewable energy and energy efficiency, and the geographic scope was international but limited to evidence available in English. So our approach was to carry out a systematic evidence review, and this is a standard approach of my team, the Technology and Policy Assessment function within UKERC, that looks at controversial topics in the energy field. And as Jan said, this updates from previous work led by Will Blythe and published in 2014. So we're very much looking to update on that. So our systematic evidence review applied a range of keywords related to job creation, different types of energy technologies or fuel sources, energy efficiency, and search terms also covered policies, financial incentives, and terms related to quality, skills, and geographic aspects of job creation. And we applied search terms to 2 databases in Google Scholar and Science Direct, restricting searches to the last 7 years to update from the 2014 review. Overall, our findings are based on analysis of 145 of the most relevant documents drawn from a wider body of just over 350 potentially relevant documents that we initially identified.
Richard, I'm really sorry. Would you mind putting your slides into presentation mode just so it's a bit easier for people to see them?
Oh yeah, sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah, so as Jan mentioned, there are different kinds of jobs that are considered in terms of job creation. So we considered studies which looked at both direct jobs created directly as a result of an investment, indirect jobs created in the wider supply chain, and induced jobs created by the additional household spending of those for whom jobs were created, say in renewable energy. And then another distinction is between gross and net jobs. So gross jobs are literally the gross jobs created by an investment, but net jobs also is a calculation that considers the difference between gross jobs created, say, in renewable energy or energy efficiency, less displaced jobs lost, say, in fossil fuel generation as a result of investment in renewable energy. Now, generally, our approach has been, because the evidence base is quite limited on net jobs and the definitions where they are used are quite inconsistent, our approach has generally been to compare gross jobs estimates for different technologies, fossil fuels compared to renewables and energy efficiency. And so you'll see that in the forthcoming charts. So on the findings on quantity of job creation, first of all, we looked at gross jobs created per £1 million invested across a range of international studies. And this data was converted to the equivalent of £1 million invested in 2020 pounds sterling. And this generally shows sort of fairly well that, well, on average, gross jobs created per level of investment is around 3 times higher for various kinds of renewables compared to, say, coal or gas generation. And then for energy efficiency is around sort of 5 times the level of job creation compared to coal or gas and oil. So, but the finding on energy efficiency comes with a small caveat that is based on a more limited evidence base compared to renewables. So another metric we looked at was to try and break down job creation by different activities. So this chart shows manufacturing and construction installation, and again is a international evidence base. The metric on the vertical axis is actually number of job years created per gigawatts installed. And so 1 job year is 1 full-time job for 1 person lasting for a year. And the reason this is used for manufacturing, construction and installation is that these jobs are assumed to occur in the first few years of a project. But what this chart in particular shows is that job creation for manufacturing and installation is particularly low for natural gas. So I guess that's very relevant now in comparison to some kinds of renewables. And what's notable there is particularly high averages for solar PV installation or offshore wind manufacturing, for example. So even if you were to consider jobs displaced in gas generation, this would still look positive for some aspects of wind and solar. This chart shows gross jobs created in operation and maintenance of different technologies. And again, you see this is sort of number of jobs per gigawatt installed capacity, because operation and maintenance jobs are assumed to carry on over the lifetime of technologies, so they don't need to be annualized. But again, you see the averages are very low for coal and natural gas in comparison to renewables or low carbon energy. So conclusions on quantity of job creation. Yeah, so I mean, overall, this does suggest that policy support for investment in low carbon renewable energy and energy efficiency can deliver more jobs than fossil fuel generation. And so there is a debate in the literature around the extent to which policies supporting renewables may contribute to longer term economic growth. But in some respects, we kind of need to move beyond the sort of jobs debate. Really, what matters in the longer run is not jobs per unit of investment, but whether the investment contributes to an economically efficient low carbon transition, accounting for environmental impacts and energy security considerations. So the UK's net zero target implies a continuous need for jobs over several decades. You know, we need to be building more renewables to cope with greater demands for electrification. You know, we urgently need much more energy efficiency in building, heat decarbonisation, retrofitting, and so on. And in terms of geographic distribution of jobs created, as Jan mentioned, we did identify that there's some interesting things about construction and installation and operation and maintenance jobs tend to be created locally within countries, although labour may be imported, but the extent to which manufacturing jobs are created locally would depend upon the presence of a local manufacturing base in a particular country. But certainly it can be said that widespread opportunities exist for jobs that would be needed across the country in energy efficiency improvements, delivery of low carbon heat. And in that respect, you know, there's at least 19 million homes in the UK that need to be upgraded to Energy Performance Certificate Band C, creating a continuous demand for jobs over the coming decades to meet net zero. So certainly in that respect, I for one personally am quite surprised that there is not much more in the government's energy security strategy on energy efficiency. Now, the other aspect that we looked at is quality of job creation. So we reviewed a number of studies which considered the skills levels of jobs in low carbon energy. And a fair amount of literature that we identified suggested that low carbon energy or energy efficiency jobs tend to be or may be higher skilled than higher carbon jobs, but this was something that may also apply to green jobs in general, being higher skilled than brown jobs. But perhaps in relation to renewable energy, the picture seems to be a bit more mixed. In this particular example, which looks at offshore wind in the UK, it's a study carried out by Grant Allen at University of Strathclyde. And this data is from UK input-output table for 2010. And it shows quite neatly that most of the jobs in offshore wind at that time were higher or medium skilled jobs, so professional or skilled trades, for example, rather than lower skilled jobs. And this is both, well, this is direct, indirect, and in induced jobs. But on the other hand, there are other studies that suggest that actually the picture's a bit more mixed. So this is data from Dominish et al. 2019. So it shows occupational data which is based on a survey of wind and solar PV industries in various developed and developing countries, carried out by IRENA. And it compares that data with occupational data for fossil fuels for Australia, which was then adjusted using regional job multipliers to represent different parts of the world. So this is an attempt to compare the two different technologies in terms of occupation types. There's a lot of detail in this chart, but a key point is that although operation and maintenance activities, for example, in solar or wind, appeared to be, and the majority of those activities appeared to be in higher skilled occupation. On the other hand, some construction and installation activities, say in solar PV, around 60% are in lower skilled occupations such as assembly, and majority of employment in the construction and installation of offshore wind is in ship crew. And then if conversely, if you look at fossil fuels, there actually close to half of employment is in higher skilled professional occupations for coal and gas generation, whereas for coal mining, it's around 50% in more lower skilled employment. So this is just to say that the picture is a bit more nuanced than simply saying that renewables might create high skilled employment only. So conclusions on job quality and skills. Well, it goes without saying really that a low carbon transition needs to create quality jobs in terms of adequate wages and employment rights, full-time employment, good working conditions, and ideally permanent rather than temporary jobs. There are a number of studies which suggest that direct employment in renewables tends to be related to temporary or short-term work, and that operation and maintenance jobs are typically more permanent. However, given the need to be continuously building renewables to meet net zero targets, that may be less of a concern. But on the other hand, we need to make sure that locally employers can move from one contract to another without having to move large distances for new work. And in terms of training, so I mentioned the nuanced picture between skill levels between renewables and fossil fuels. So it's important, therefore, that policies supporting green job creation are carefully coordinated with the provision of sufficient training over the current decade to supply the requisite green skills. And so alongside key skills gaps in energy efficiency and low carbon heat installation, I would also refer to the Green Jobs Task Force report published last year, which also anticipated further gaps with expected growth in the UK's offshore wind sector and the need to upgrade and expand electricity networks to support increased renewables capacity. And then finally, we identified some evidence to indicate that women are underrepresented in green jobs occupations, training programs, and the UK engineering sector in general. So that's really it, and thank you very much.
And now we're going to move on to some responses to the report from 3 different organisations, and we'll start with a response from Chloe Nemo Ramirez. I hope I have that right, from the Climate Change Committee, who I notice is currently very much involved in assessing the labour and distribution impacts of a transition to net zero. So I think Chloe, you all have plenty of thoughts on the report. So please let us have your thoughts.
Yes, thank you very much. I think just from reading the report and listening to the presentation just now, I'd say in short that it's a report that provides important conclusions at the right time. They're important for us at the CCC because, first of all, it confirms some of the analysis that we've been developing, which finds that there is likely to be a positive impact on net zero rather than a negative one. That's reassuring, although not completely surprising, I think, based on the analysis that we had done for the Südthermal budget, because that's where we saw that we needed to grow the electricity sector twice the size that it is now. And we also need to grow a hydrogen economy that is essentially going from scratch today to growing it to the size of the current electricity sector. So what that means really is that we'll be shifting towards more domestic energy supply, and even more so now that the energy security strategy is actively aiming for more energy independence. So yeah, definitely that was very reassuring to see from the report. But I guess where it gets a bit more complicated is understanding where these jobs will be. Will they be good jobs? What does that mean for people more generally? And I think, as the report shows, the net effects are not as clear. There are some research gaps that need to be filled. One of the key insights for me is obviously the point on short versus long-term jobs. I think that's really, as Richard was just walking us through now, the report finds that there will be jobs in manufacturing and installation of renewable energy that will be available for decades, given the span of the transition. And that's really positive. Then there is this question, and where there's less certainty over sustaining long-term growth that benefits workers. So I think that's going to be really key, and then that's a really key insight for us as well. And so that it will, I think a lot of this will depend on what government puts forward in terms of creating and supporting workers. And for example, that can come from just securing parts of the supply chains in the UK while we transition to net zero. So yeah, this is definitely somewhere where I think we had already found that there was a lot of uncertainty, but it's definitely a key insight from the report. And I think, just as I was saying at the beginning, it is a report that comes at the right time. When, from the CCC perspective, again, I think we know that we've had net zero legislated for 3 years now. We also have a pathway from government that was published a few months ago with the net zero strategy. And now there needs to be a shift really on delivering in the 2020s. And this question about workers and skills is just really key to delivering net zero. So that's why, as part of this, it's really crucial that we have a robust approach of estimating jobs, and that we also need to identify research gaps now in order to develop the evidence base that can allow us to then develop relevant and effective policy that puts in motion the right action in order to grow the workforce and the skills that we need to deliver net zero. And that's what the report does here. So just to say that, really welcome what's been done, and really valuable from our perspective. And hopefully this is just the start of more evidence and more research in this area.
Thanks very much, Chloe. That's very interesting, and clearly the report's going to be a very useful tool for you. Let me just move on now to, I'm going to get all of our responses before we move on to some questions. And let me just now move to Charles Wood from Energy UK. Obviously, you're all members, Charles, are at the sharp end of recruiting and providing these jobs. So what's your thoughts on the report?
I'm going to be uncontroversial and just agree with everything that Chloe has said. Broadly, the CCC is completely right. It is really timely. It is a positive report, and it's very helpful to see that sort of analysis of the impact on existing jobs as well as the actual new jobs that could be created. And that's one of the things that the sector is already looking at. I'd say the two big areas that we're currently focusing on are, firstly, offshore wind, where we're looking to retrain and upskill and train as many staff as we can in order to deliver the 40 gigawatt target, as well as energy efficiency and heat, or just generally domestic retrofit. So beyond heat and energy efficiency, also looking at electric vehicle charge points, solar PV, and all the other technologies that we don't know about yet. So there is a significant amount of work being done already by the sector in order to fill out those roles, in order to make sure that we have a pipeline of skilled workers coming in. And we're also looking to the existing workers, for example, the 136,000 trained gas installers that are currently operating around the UK. How do we retrain them for heat pumps? How many of them are going to move into new roles? And with that consideration, do we need a whole revamp of how we organise that sector? We currently have an aging set of employees in that sector, most likely to see quite a few job losses over the next 10 years. So how can we replace them not only with existing skilled workers, but also how do we train up new generation in order to get that diverse and enthusiastic workforce that will be in those roles for the rest of their lives. So it's a real challenge at the moment, but there's a lot of work being done. There's a few skills centres in particular that have been set up in order to show how whole house retrofit can work, and a few training certifications that are in progress and in development, and some of them already available for a lot of those skills. But this report is absolutely, it's the right time for this report to be coming, because we're now moving to that point where we've got this evidence and we can understand, yes, there will be more jobs from low carbon, but now we need to know how, we need to know when, and we need to know where. So we need to really get into the detail and figure out, how do we train up these workers? Where do we put manufacturing bases if they don't exist already? And how do we decarbonize existing sectors as well? There are a lot of sectors that don't get much discussion, but one of the ones that is always going to be vocal is the steel manufacturing sector. And decarbonizing existing industry is a real challenge, and we need to figure out, how do we get the skilled workers in place in order to do that, in order to deliver it, and how do we retrain or upskill those existing workers in order to be fit for purpose as we go forwards. So a lot of challenges yet to come, but this is a really good foundation set out in this report for how do we then ask the rest of the questions.
Great, thanks, Charles. And it sounds as though some of those concerns are going to very much overlap with concerns that might be raised by our next respondent, who's Anna Markova, Policy Officer on Industry and Climate at the Trade Union Congress. Anna, do you want to give your response?
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me, and yeah, very much welcome the publication of this report. There's a lot of useful data there. I feel like I will, just spend the next couple of hours pouring into the detail of the graphs, in particular that detailed data on the breakdown of types of occupation that will be created by different energy technology, I think is a step towards the type of data that's really needed in order to plan for workforce reskilling and upskilling, and that's something that that we hear a lot is a really big gap right now. In terms of the training provision, and in terms of the pathways for the current workforce to transition into the zero carbon energy future. But I wanted to make a couple of other comments as well around sort of providing a little bit of the policy context that these investments will operate in, and maybe these are kind of questions for further reflection, for further research. One is that the results of an investment depend on the conditions that are placed on this investment and around it. So, as one person already mentioned in the Q&A, depending on what type of licensing process, what type of economic setup you have around energy generation, an investment in, for example, offshore wind might lead to creating good stable jobs in the UK, including in manufacturing, or it might not. The regime that we've had for quite a few years of the CFD auctions that determine kind of where subsidies go for renewable energy, that's pushed companies to try and cut costs in a way that in part also contributed to the offshoring of jobs. And this means that there are communities, in particular in the northeast of Scotland, where fabrication yards are standing empty while there's a wind turbine being built right within view of them. And the foundations for that wind turbine, even though the fabrication yard could have provided them, are actually being made elsewhere. So when we're thinking about how to ensure that good jobs are created, we need to think about, okay, well, what conditions can be placed on investment, and how can we ensure and how can we incentivize supply chain jobs that are local? That's one comment. And another comment is that good jobs, the idea of good jobs is not just about the high skill level and high pay, and the report does mention this, but I think it's harder because there's less data on, for example, what levels of holiday and sick pay are offered in jobs, what amount of jobs are unionized, where do we have jobs that offer the right flexibility options for parents and carers to work in them. All of these things also form part of the quality of jobs, and health and safety as well. We do hear from our member unions, we do hear quite a lot of concerns, in particular in offshore wind again, from workers who've experienced some difficulties with the health and safety records of their employers, and with that approach. That's not, those are individual cases, and we don't have complete data on this, but it's important that we also measure and that we also record the other aspects of job quality, and that when policymakers think through investment conditions, that the quality of jobs created, not just the quantity of jobs created, should be a big consideration. And of course, coming from the trade union movement, the one thing that really ensures that these things get put into place is workers' voice. So ensuring that workers who currently work in, whether it is high carbon energy industry or renewable energy industry, that those workers are at the table when policy decisions are being made, when plans are being made for where they will work, when companies kind of decide on their own decarbonisation plans and their own kind of reprofiling of their business to fit net zero. Having workers at the table is one of the best levers for ensuring that those things actually are put in place. I'll stop there, and thank you very much for having me.
Great, thanks, Anna. And in fact, yes, let me come to that question in the chat now, actually, because I think I'd be interested to hear what our other speakers and Richard and Jan had to pick up on that. And I'll just go through the question. It's quite a long one. I'll be missing a point here by not considering where jobs will be created and the role of contracting / procurement in this. Scotland predicted over 40,000 jobs in offshore wind, but the reality is less than 3,000 have been created because the contracts were awarded to companies in China. So that it looks on paper as though there's a lot of jobs, but the UK base, it could be very small. That would require a radical change to the current contracting or procurement strategy. And that's, I think, also interesting in light of the supply chain plans that government requires for its contracts for difference measures, which have actually been challenged under the World Trade Organization by the EU. But would anybody else, I think, Anna, you've come back on that question. Does anybody else want to pick up on that?
Yeah, I'd love to.
I think Charles is in there, yes.
Yeah, you've already mentioned the supply chain process that's going on at the moment, and how we're trying to ensure that offshore wind, particularly that new tranche of offshore wind that will be coming in the next 10 years, is onshored, that we have onshore manufacturing and supply chains. And that process has really revealed a lot of the challenges around it and a lot of the potential benefits as well. There are companies that have effectively gained a bit of a foothold in the sector because they are UK companies that have been gone to, but there is a long process of educating those organisations, making sure the supply chain understands what we're looking for as an energy sector, when we're going to be looking for it, and how they can get involved in that process and in the tender process or just in the general engagement process. But there are certainly things to be said for other parts of the sector as well. Heat and energy efficiency in particular show a lot of potential. There's about 10,000 jobs in boiler manufacturing in parts of the UK. And it's likely that part of that will continue for hydrogen boilers, but what about heat pumps? Again, Scotland jumping out ahead, and they have a series of manufacturing hubs for heat pumps that need to be expanded, but we do need to be looking at how can the UK onshore all of these supply chains in order to make sure that we are manufacturing, exporting, and including UK jobs in the process of decarbonisation. So it's a real challenge, and it is something that was mentioned in the supply strategy today was increasing the amount of manufacturing of heat pumps. That is really positive to see. We absolutely should be getting a jump on that as a country, and using that as a bit of an export potential in future, not only for heat pumps, but because it's the same, in principle, same technology as air conditioning. And we know that as temperatures go up, more people will need air conditioning units. So it's a big potential area for us. But yeah, absolutely agree with Anna's points. Including workers in this process is critical, and onshoring what we can makes a lot of sense.
Richard, did you want to respond from the?
Yeah, I just going to make the point that I think going forward, one of the issues we found in our study is the data on regional job creation is actually very poor in the UK. So there's the low carbon and renewable energy economy statistics produced by the Office for National Statistics, and this is a good data set, but it doesn't provide regional breakdowns yet. So we actually need to know what progress the UK is making, and we don't have data. We're not going to be able to know whether we're creating these jobs locally or elsewhere, and obviously the data needs to be granular enough to look at different kinds of occupations, whether they're in manufacturing or construction or operation and maintenance and so on.
I can see that Anna wants to come in on that, but I think I'll just relate this to a second question that's come into the Q&A from Taimur Anwar, which says that the data presented is international. Are there UK specific data? To what extent are skills gaps limiting investment in higher value jobs, and does the time frame for reskilling factor into investment decisions? So this question about cracking open these broad numbers that we've got and finding out more about exactly how they break down as regards sort of skills within roles, different regional requirements. This is obviously going to be key to what we're doing. So Anna, would you like to?
Sure, yeah. Okay, I'll answer with a couple of slightly sort of random unrelated things, as in unrelated to each other, but obviously related to the questions. So on UK level data, one of the things that makes it hard to create UK level data is that renewable energy is actually, and correct me if I'm wrong, please, other panelists, but I feel like part of the problem is that renewable energy doesn't fit all that neatly into the standard economic classifications that we've got, and so you tend to get data from ONS that's quite detailed on manufacturing, for example, that won't be that detailed on energy, but perhaps I'll leave it to other panelists to get back on the detail of that. In terms of skills gaps and limiting investment in higher value jobs, I think there's definitely examples where the reverse is happening. So tidal energy is one of them, tidal and wave energy. So in Scotland, for a while, Scotland was more or less a global hub for the development of research and development in tidal and wave. And then the available investment, and it was mostly public investment from the UK, has been drying up, whereas France and Canada have put up more money. And so as a result, you've actually got engineers leaving for these other countries where that investment is more available. So that's just a kind of cautionary tale around public investment availability and jobs. And the only other thing that I was going to say in relation to the previous question is just that one piece I think we're missing around how to create local supply chain jobs is ports. So part of the reason why I think the UK supply chains struggle to get more of a share of the value chain of offshore renewables. It's partly because we have ports that have been sort of chronically underinvested in compared to, let's say, Germany, and with turbines growing bigger and bigger, we do need to invest in those port upgrades so that the parts can actually come into the ports and be worked on.
Great points. Thank you very much, Anna. And this question about exactly where the data comes from, I think is again a very important question. I had a question reading the report as to how the high skill versus medium skill and low skill jobs would map onto other types of job categorization, as for example in the trades type jobs, which I know are very often extremely important, and also very we're also very short of those kind of skilled workers. Jan or Chloe, do you want to come in on either of those questions before I move to the next one, or Richard, do you want to come back again?
I could just add that I think we would, a lot of what's being said about creating or onshoring jobs in those supply chains, based on the sorts of policy and economic strategy of the last few decades now, that would imply quite a shift in thinking around macroeconomic approaches to work, and to a political argument that there is that broader, longer term prosperity to be created and sustained through that upfront policy framework for bringing jobs back and for creating the sort of systematic reskilling that we're discussing here. Because I think the argument for a long time has been that it doesn't matter where the jobs are as long as they are competitive, as it were. Well, is that still the case, I wonder?
Yeah, I think, and if I can add, I guess something that we can see from the net zero review that Treasury published is that identifying where the UK's comparative advantage is going to be is pretty much what's going to define how, which supply chains are going to be in the UK. And on the one hand, having just making sure that we are supporting workers and that net zero is creating jobs is key to that. And there will be sectors in which there are still opportunities that the government has to create. So I'm thinking in surface transport, we know that battery manufacturing can be huge. And so getting those supply chains in the UK would create a lot of jobs. But it's still up in the air, and there's a question about whether the UK will be in that position. In other sectors like offshore wind, we have China that has a very mature market, which also allows us to have lower costs offshore wind. And I guess there's a trade-off between, in this case, on the worker side, and just having employment in the UK, and at the same time making sure that we have, when we were talking about CFD and policy costs, I mean, there's a question about how consumers might need to pay for that if we end up having a system that just brings up costs. So there's a bit of a trade-off, and that's what the net zero review highlights. It highlights a bit of those trade-offs between the incentivizing sort of the uptake of cost-effective low carbon technologies and having this wider distributional impacts on jobs. And that's where the uncertainty is, and what's blocking, I think, a bit of the progress in the area.
I think it's interesting, this point that seems to have come up, that one of the positive outcomes of the supply chain planning requirements is an ability to identify where the UK really could fill in some gaps in the supply chain and start to build some really important UK industries. And that brings us to a question that always arises in this kind of discussion about joined up government and whether we can make the really deploy these strengths that we have. And perhaps that brings me on to another question in the Q&A, which goes back to retrofit and energy efficiency. Which is also a huge skills opportunity for the UK of all different types, as speakers have already mentioned. So our questioner says, who is Adrian Galt, by the way, we know there is a huge task on retrofit and energy efficiency in buildings. The conclusions of this report support previous work, and I think generally that's the case. There's no argument about the value of that. So why doesn't this have traction with the Treasury? And that's a key question for many of us. And would anybody like to take that one on? Charles is, I think, Charles, you've got your hand up.
So I don't want to assume to be able to guess the mind of the Chancellor. I think we can kind of see the viewpoint of the Chancellor so far. The energy supply strategy was yet another opportunity for us to dedicate new funding to heat and energy efficiency. The first way to make bills cheaper is to spend less on energy because you're using less energy. So energy efficiency makes sense. It also has specific proven improvements to the effectiveness and productivity of workers because you've got comfortable homes and comfortable offices. It also has incredible benefits in terms of reduced costs for the NHS, both from people not being cold and also from things like air pollution that are currently churned out by gas boilers across the country. And there are also there's massive potential for that job creation as we go towards the 600,000 heat pump installations target, and as we look at energy efficiency and retrofitting effectively most of the buildings in the UK. So why this hasn't gotten through to Treasury, we don't know. We know that BIEE is very much on board and very much in favour. We know that number 10 has gotten the point. They understand what's going on and they understand the potential benefits of energy efficiency and low carbon heat. But Treasury is unfortunately refusing to spend any money on anything at the moment, even what seems like a very wise investment.
I think it's interesting, Charles, that you referred to the energy supply strategy, and that's one of the responses I've seen from it this morning, that it is an energy supply strategy and not an energy security strategy as it's billed, because there's nothing happening on the demand side of that security equation. So thanks for illustrating that. Now, unfortunately, we are running out of time on the webinar now, so I think I'm just going to ask each of the panelists to make a final point, which might be about a gap that should be on the agenda for perhaps for a follow-up report or for the next on the agenda for UKERC, but alternatively, what should be on the agenda for government? What's the first thing that they should do? And I will go to our responders, if I can say. I'll come in reverse order and start with Anna. Would you like to make a final point?
I think I'll just echo the sort of bafflement of why the energy security strategy doesn't include anything on demand. I think I can understand that some decision makers involved might have been burned by the experience of the Green Homes Grant, which flopped. But I think we now know that it's that if rather than relying on a scheme that's fragmented and relies on individual homeowners to do their thing and individual tiny companies to do their thing, if you do something more coordinated, for example via local authorities, then you get the results that you need, and we've seen that demonstrated by recent schemes. So yeah, I think very much first thing to do for government is to fix that.
Great, thank you. I think Charles, you would come next.
I think coordination would be the main thing. Treasury is the obvious sticking point, but I think coordination with local and devolved governments is also really critical. And it's one of the big things that is causing such an issue with trying to figure out where are these jobs going to be, is that they're all competing for them. They all want the manufacturing hub to be in their back garden. They all want these jobs to be for their constituents. So having a bit of a core understanding of where do we need this technology, where do we need these jobs most, will really help, and there's no real sign of that coordination from government, so that's what they should focus on right now.
Thanks, Charles. Chloe?
Yeah, and I think just to echo what's been said, but I guess I think there's a need to just address the uncertainty at the moment that still exists. There are a few things that are no-brainers. Energy efficiency, I mean, it is one. There are others where identifying just who should be doing what in order to support job creation and also just workers during the transition is more complicated. Just understanding the role of local authorities as opposed to business and government. I think research should focus on, we should have more research in order to address the uncertainty, to ensure that we have a good understanding of what kind of targeted policies we can put forward in this space. And I think that's the next step, and I know that BIEE is starting to think about this. So hopefully we're in the right way, in the right track.
Okay, so coming to Richard, I think you've been given some suggestions for the next step following this. Any response, and what would you like to see happen next?
Yeah, so I mean, I would echo sort of the points made about joined up government. So I think there does need to be much greater coordination between policies supporting low carbon energy or energy efficiency, and what those imply in terms of job creation, and then that needs to be coordinated with understanding what the resultant training needs will be, and the quantity and types of training that needs to be developed. And really, we need a kind of clear roadmap and timetable for that going forward.
That's great, thank you, Richard. Jan, do you want to cap that off and make your own plea?
One quick comment is that there is an embryonic scheme in place, of course, in England around the Green Homes Grant local authority delivery scheme, which does seem to be working pretty well, albeit it's far too small. Its funding base is too small, but it has met with very positive reception, broadly speaking. There is also a significant plan in place in Scotland for retrofitting the entire building stock through the heat in building strategy. So in different parts of the UK, we are there to some extent, or we're moving in the right direction. And I would like to see research that builds on and emphasises the value to UK PLC, etc., from that kind of investment in our building stock, and therefore in all of the co-benefits that go along with that.
Great, thanks, Jan. And if I can add my own wish, I think it's great for those of us who are writing about this kind of thing to have that kind of real sort of local stories about the kind of outcomes there might be for particular areas or particular types of trades or particular types of workers who can benefit from these industries coming to their region. It gives it gives sort of journalists and people who are talking about the industry really something to get their teeth into a little bit, and it gives it an immediacy. So if there's skilled jobs of a particular type coming to your region, it's something that you want to write about, and it's good news. So I wouldn't underestimate that. So thank you very much, everybody. We're just a couple of minutes over, and I'm sure we could have gone on talking for quite a long time, but I'd like to thank you all for your contributions, and I hope everybody's enjoyed the webinar. I really encourage you to download the report. The link is in the is in the chat, and carry on the conversation on social media for both UKERC and BIEE. The recording will be available on both websites shortly. So thank you very much, panelists, once again. Thank you, delegates. And I look forward to seeing you at another seminar in the future.